Hello everyone. Let me just get positioned correctly here. Okay, there we go. So we're going to finish off philosophy of mind today. We just have a few little loose ends to wrap up, and then we'll move on to the question of free will and determinism. Which one is true? Are they both true? Are they compatible, incompatible? Yeah, we'll get into that. But for now, let's talk about philosophy of mind a little bit. So first, let's just do a quick recap of physicalism. And again, remember, physicalism is a general view. Here, when we're talking about the mind, it means that the mind is physical in some way, or it's based on something physical, and it's not its own immaterial substance, its own thing, like it is for Descartes, right? Remember, Descartes is a dualist. He thought there's immaterial realities, there's immaterial stuff. Minds are one example of that. And then he thought there's the whole physical world besides that. Well, physicalism says, no, it's just the physical world. Whatever the mind is, whatever consciousness is, whatever all these various things we associate with the mind, whatever they are, they fit into our overall naturalistic picture of the world. They fit into, they can fit, the mind can fit into science just fine, for example, on the view of physicalism, right? Because the science can study the physical world, and if consciousness is just part of the physical world, then science can study it. That's the position of physicalism. Now, there's different ways to do this, right? One way was behaviorism, where you just don't really talk about what we actually tend to think of as mental states, right? Things that you actually experience internally. They say, no, it's just all about inputs and outputs. It's all about the behavior. It's all about stimulus, response. Let's not talk about what supposedly happens in between, because the argument goes, we don't have access to other people's mental states, so we can't study them scientifically. So let's just leave all this subjective stuff out of it. Let's focus on what we can actually empirically measure, which is inputs from the environment and then outputs as behavior. So in this view, pain really is just if we say that someone's in pain, it means that there's certain behaviors that we associate with that, and that's all it really is. Of course, this is it's difficult to take this too seriously if this is the right way to put it. Some behaviorists might want to argue with this way of putting it, but this is certainly a pretty standard way of putting it. This is not my position here, right? But it's kind of weird to think that pain would only refer to the behaviors or the dispositions to behave. What about the ouchy feeling itself, right? If you've ever been in pain, you would wish that pain was just behavioral, right? But no, it feels a certain way. It feels like something. Okay, so identity theory, we're going to take the same basic model here, but it says it's not really about the inputs or your behavior. What the mind is just your brain. Your brain is this thing that can do all this cool stuff, and it's just brain states, ultimately, that we're talking about. So being in pain is just being in a certain brain state, right? Or thinking about Paris is just being in a certain brain state, and that's it. We saw problems for that, because it seems as though it's identifying it too much with the material substratum, right? Because, for example, in computers, we can talk about software really just being hardware. But, of course, software can be implemented on different kinds of hardware. It doesn't have to be a specific kind. So making it all just about the brain was maybe a little too narrow, right? So on that view, pain just refers to nothing over and above just a particular type of brain state. So you would literally be able to see someone's pain inside their brain on this view. Which again might lend itself to the same criticism as behaviorism, right? Because again, you could see maybe all the stuff that's going on inside the brain, but you wouldn't actually be having an experience of pain. So you, in that way, would not have access to someone's pain. You can't actually experience the pain as they feel it on this view. All you can do is look inside the brain and study all the brain states that are associated with the mental state of being in pain. So that's a possible weakness And functionalism, you can look at it in this way. You can look at it as though it's synthesizing what both of these are saying. And it's saying, sorry, my head is in the way of this thing here. It still just says output right here. Mental states are functional states, says functionalism. So yes, we can study the inputs, and yes, we can study the outputs, and yes, we know that with humans, the hardware is the brain, so brain scientists can study the way that brains function, right? And this is why this is the paradigm view in the science of the brain science. We study how the brain does it. How does the brain take an input from the environment and then translate it to some sort of behavioral output? Mental states are functional states on that view. Yeah. So you can see that these are all physicalist theories. They don't posit any kind of immaterial substance. We're dealing purely with the natural physical world on this view. Okay. Let's see. So in functionalism, pain ultimately refers to nothing above and beyond the functions that translate environmental input. In our case of a human being, that could be something like stimulation of nerve endings into some sort of output, the pain behavior. Right? Pain is just the thing that's in between. Right? It's the processing of the input into the output. So this, in many ways, fits behaviorism pretty nicely, because those inputs and outputs, those are important, and they are part of what it means. We have to understand the relationship between inputs and outputs to truly understand what's happening inside the mind. So functionalism in that way is a bit like behaviorism, but it takes into account what mind-brain identity theorists take into account, right? The actual hardware that makes all that possible. Go back to my phone analogy. Right? The behaviorist is someone who will just study the inputs and the outputs, right? If I tap like this, then this pops up. If I tap on it, then this pops up. If I slide my finger, this happens. That's behaviorism. Identity theory says, well, there's more to a phone than that, right? There's all the actual hardware in there. That's really what it's all about. Let's look at that. But then, of course, if you really want to explain what your Facebook app is, it doesn't really make sense to say that it's identical with that physical stuff. No, the Facebook app, it's a certain functionality. It's if I tap like this, then I expect a certain thing to pop up, and if I tap on that, then I expect this to happen. Right? So you don't get the functionality part of it on identity theory. Functionalism is the only one out of all three that says it's about all of it. Right? You got to study the way that the inputs get translated to outputs, but that also takes understanding how the physical machinery does it. So science can get inside the phone and see how it all works. But what's important here is that the various functionalities that a phone has, we have to explain them functionally, not just in terms of what the underlying matter stuff is, because that can change. Right? I can put a Facebook app on a totally different kind of phone, put it on something entirely different altogether. As long as it's got the same functionality, then it's still Facebook. So the functionalist is going to say the same thing about pain, right? Okay. Yeah. And we kind of discussed this just a little bit, right? Functionalism entails that, in principle, there's no reason that a machine couldn't be conscious. That's something human created. As long as we created something that behaves in context just like a human being, right? So there would have to be no tells, as it were. It'd have to be a pretty perfect thing, right? So it would have to be something like, well, this could just be your roommate who happens to be made out of wires if you look inside his body, right? Maybe there's some computer chips in there, but he's just your buddy that you hang out and drink beer with, and you talk about the stuff you talk about. You go have fun together. It doesn't matter on that view that it's made of some different stuff than you, right? It's as much a person as you are on this kind of a view. Okay. Pause it and switch it to this. Right here. Okay, we've looked at this before. I call this the Great Chain of Being. There's a big landscape scene by Bierstadt. And I showed you the the medieval kind of chain of being or a hierarchy of reality that's based on Platonism. Right? We have increasing realness as we go upwards. Right? For Plato, this would be the form of the good is way at the top, and then all the individual forms down here, and then the sort of shadows that those forms cast into the physical world where we are, and then it goes down towards less and less of a reality, right? So medieval theologians adopted this kind of Platonistic view of the universe as a kind of a hierarchy of things that exist. We have a kind of a, we have this in here as well. This is just revisiting that form matter distinction that we've learned about before. And again, that actually came up, right, when we talked about functional identity and material identity, when we did functionalism. That's really just form and matter all over again. Right? It's the same kind of distinction. The idea being here, you have some sort of matter and you impose a form on it so that it has a certain kind of function. So form and function are tied together. You start out with some raw material and you shape it in some sort of structure, and then you get something that has a functionality, right? You put mud together in the right way, or clay, bake it, and you get this hard object that you can then do stuff with, right? For example, right here, you can, if you have enough of them, then that becomes raw material, matter, for you to impose another kind of order or form on to get a different kind of functionality. So you could take these bricks and make them into a wall, or you can make them into a nice little fire pit. Whatever it is that you want to do, whatever functionality those bricks are able to bring about, you can do that. Hopefully you remember this, but this is a good thing to sort of review, okay? I think I'm just going to go to the very end where you see it all put together. Okay? So this is a good time to talk about the idea of reductionism, right? Reductionism is the view that ultimately all these higher levels, they're ultimately nothing but a bunch of atoms. And we can see that most clearly if you go step by step, right? We understand atoms, and yes, they also have a certain structure, so maybe we can go even lower than that. But let's just stick with atoms for now, right? We understand that everything around us in the physical world is made of atoms. Right? So atoms can combine in various different ways to form molecules. Molecules can get together in various ways to produce things like living cells. And living cells are just these little, in a way, they're just biological machines, right? They're made up of nothing but molecules. We don't have to postulate anything extra but just physical molecules. And molecules, again, are just atoms. They're just atoms in a certain form, atoms with a certain structure, right? And we understand that if you form is tied to function, and so we can see the same thing happening here. We take those molecules, the right kinds of molecules, combine them the right kind of way, and you get the functionality of a cell. Cells are amazing. There are single-celled organisms that can exist on their own, so they're living beings. But we understand that there's nothing going on there but molecules, physical molecules, to create this little factory. And this goes all the way up to other organisms as well, right? So any organism in the natural world, and let's be frank, human beings are part of that world, no matter how special we think we are. We do share the planet with a bunch of other organisms, and guess what? All us organisms are made up out of cells, and cells are all made up of molecules, and molecules are all made of atoms. So reductionism says, well then, all the stuff that exists in the physical world is ultimately reducible down to atoms. And if you want to understand how molecules really work, you have to understand atomic theory. If you want to understand how cells really work, you have to understand molecular theory. If you want to understand how a particular organism works, you have to understand about cells. And about the way that cells get together to form organs, and the way that organs get together to form the organisms. So this represents, scientific knowledge. And it also gives us a kind of a picture to think about in terms of how does the mind fit into all this? How does consciousness fit into this? And the whole idea has been, if Descartes was wrong, there aren't two different kinds of substances, then how does consciousness fit into this picture, right? And one way to talk about it is to talk about it the same way that we talk about life, right? Life, what is it? For a long time, people thought that life should be defined as a kind of an essence or a vital spirit that gets infused into physical stuff to make it alive. So in this view, life is its own kind of force. Just like for Descartes, the mind is its own kind of thing, its own kind of substance that can be joined with just matter in a weird way that we don't understand. Right? The view used to be, this is called vitalism, that life is like that too, that life is this sort of special thing that has to be injected into mere dead matter. But we do not agree with that at all anymore. Anyone that's familiar with biology will understand this point very well. From a biological point of view, what life is just the functioning cell, right? If we're looking at just a single-celled organism, just to make it easy, right? Let's zoom in on this a little bit, right? Cells have this particular physical structure. Each of its parts are made out of, you guessed it, molecules. Right? And these molecules just get together, they have a certain structure, and out of this structure arises this new functionality. It's an emergent property, life. Right? We don't talk about molecules being alive. The concept just does not apply at this level of reality. We don't talk about atoms being alive because that concept just does not apply to this level of reality. That concept applies to this level of reality, where you have enough molecules getting together in complex enough of a way to support the functionality that cells have. Things like reproduction, things like taking in nutrients that it needs and then pooping them out, right? That's what defines life at this basic molecular level. That's life. That's all there's to it. We didn't need a bunch of molecules to get injected with a life force. No, they just had to be combined in the right way to get this functionality, right? The same way, I love my phone example, the same way that you don't need to inject some sort of mysterious software stuff into it, right? You just put the hardware together the right way, then we get these functionalities. Those functionalities that phones have, individual molecules don't have that. Individual atoms don't have that. Okay? But at the same time, the phone is nothing but atoms. They're just combined in the right way. They have the right kind of structure. Right? That's all you need, right? You get these emergent properties, things like, being able to go on Facebook. We didn't used to be able to do that. We could only do that once we put together the right molecules in the right way. So there's nothing all that mysterious about phenomena like life, and there's nothing all that mysterious about the fact that we only apply that word once we get to this level of reality, right? The basic phenomena that we study are different when you zoom in on reality so this close. And then when you zoom out a little bit to molecules, we just don't have the kind of stuff that we associate with life. That does not happen until we get to this higher level of cells. So life just is not a mystery. It's not much of a philosophical puzzle either. There's got to be some literature out there on that, but it's not the same as the problem of the mind or consciousness. So a way to phrase the question is to ask, is the mind just a kind of an emergent property? Right? That it's the same sort of thing as you got enough cells put together into these various organs, and the organs are all put together in a certain way so that you get a human being, right? Is that enough to explain the mind, in the same way that all you need to do is put together, let's go all the way down to the level of atoms, put atoms together in the right way, you get living cells. Can we say the same thing about consciousness? If you put the right atoms in the right combination so that they're like human beings, do you get consciousness? That's the question. The physicalist says, yes, you do, right? Physicalists might disagree in some way how to spell it out exactly, but that's the basic idea, that consciousness, all the faculties of the mind, are no more philosophically mysterious than life is. Right? And all you really need to do to study how it works is to study the physical structure, just like to understand life is to understand the physical structure that allows for that kind of functionality to occur. Now, the problem has been, even by people who like this idea, right, this kind of a reductionist idea that consciousness ultimately is only possible because of physical systems, and physical systems are ultimately reducible down to atoms. Right? Even for people who like that view, there is a kind of a problem, which is that with a cell, if you look at a cell and you see it's functioning, that's all you need. Then you've seen life. That's it. You've seen it. You know it's alive because you see it functioning correctly. With human beings and consciousness, it's not as easy. Now, this might all be wrong, but many philosophers have this intuition that for a human being, or something that looks like a human being, you could see all the physical stuff happening, and you could look inside their brain and see all the synapses firing, and you could see perhaps all the brain events that are associated with mental events. Maybe you can see those happening, but the question still remains, is this person actually conscious, for example? Right? Let's stick with consciousness, because that's usually been the sticking point, right? The people who disagree with this kind of view that we have here, they'll readily admit that a lot of the stuff that we do, that our minds can do, is because of brain function. The real problem is consciousness, right? So, by consciousness, I don't just mean what medically you mean by being conscious. I mean, you're having consciousness, right? There's something that it is like to be you. We can bring up the pain example again. Right? You could look inside someone's brain and notice a brain event happening that we've associated with pain, and you could see all the physical stuff happening. But do you really know that the person is in pain? Right? This is where the idea of a philosophical zombie comes in. Right? This is a thought experiment used a lot in this area. Especially David Chalmers is one of these people that really has a problem with the physicalist view as normally understood. The idea being, it's at least conceivable that you could have a human being who is physically behaving just like other human beings, but they're not actually conscious the way that we are, right? So perhaps there is the processing of nerve damage going on, and it gets translated to the right kind of behavior that we expect. So when this person gets pinched, they go, "Ow, that hurt." Okay, but how do we know that they actually felt the feeling, the subjective feeling of pain? We can't sort of check inside their minds to see if it's there. Right? So in the life example, once you see the right kind of functioning, once you see the physical parts moving the right way, then you know you've got life. That's all there's to it. But it's not as easy to do with something like consciousness, because you could see someone behaving in a human-like way, but it's at least logically conceivable that they're not actually conscious. Now, it's a weird kind of a thought experiment. It's not supposed to show that, hey, for all we know, there might be a bunch of zombies walking around. Philosophical zombies here, right? Meaning someone who actually behaves just like a regular person, but lacks subjective consciousness, does not actually feel feelings, is not actually consciously aware of anything. You know, when they have a sip of coffee, and maybe they'll smell it, they'll go, smells good, and then they drink it. Well, what they're doing is their brains are translating the input and bringing this output, this smell of coffee, right? It's doing all that just right, just as a physicalist would say. It's just a bunch of brain processes that are translating that input of the smell of coffee to the output of saying, coffee. But the philosophical zombie possibility says that, well, maybe that's all they're doing. They're just physically processing it, but they're not actually subjectively smelling what the smell of coffee smells like to them. It's kind of a weird thing to think about, but it's really just as simple as it's logically possible, right? You could imagine a scenario, a possible world, as it's sometimes put, where you have humans behaving just as humans do, and yet they lack this kind of special awareness, this consciousness, this what it is like to be in that physical state, if we're going to talk about the physical state. What is it like to be in pain? Well, it seems as though there's more to it than just the brain activity, because, again, you could see someone's brain activity and still not be entirely sure that they are really in pain. And you could even ask them if they're in pain, but if they're a philosophical zombie, they will say yes. They will say all the right stuff. They'll say everything that normal humans say. And yet, they didn't actually feel that ouchy feeling. Well, we don't know. We can't know. So there's a disconnect here. There's kind of a wedge here. That's not the case with life. Because again, if you see a cell operating, functioning normally, well then, case closed. It's alive. That's what we mean by being alive. With consciousness, the problem, just the way that it's sometimes put, is that it's not as easy as you what you see is what you get. It's not like that. You could be seeing a functioning human being who lacks consciousness. This is the main problem that people like to discuss in response to things like physicalism and mind-brain identity theory, is to bring up this idea that consciousness perhaps is just not reducible down to a bunch of atoms structured in the right way. Right? So this has led people like Dave Chalmers, right, who I mentioned, who likes to use the philosophical zombie argument a lot. He posits something like, well, maybe consciousness is just not reducible to anything else. Maybe it's a bottom-level reality thing, right? Maybe it's like atoms. Or maybe it's, if we can go further down to gluons, or maybe just electrons, whatever the basic building blocks are that we're using to build up these more elaborate structures. Maybe consciousness is just one of those basic elements of the universe that exists in varying degrees. So that's why there's sometimes this view is called panpsychism, the idea that mind or consciousness pervades the entire universe. It's not exactly in the same way that certain religious beliefs incorporate that idea as well. It's not as though they're saying, like, well, maybe your pillow is actually aware of things or feels pain. They're not saying that, because to have the kind of consciousness that human beings have, you have to have a lot of the consciousness all put together in the right way. Right? So it's maybe not as exciting as it sounds. Right? It doesn't mean objects are conscious in the way that we think of conscious, but maybe there's just a very, very, very small degree of it that's just part of the natural world, and so they hope to avoid this problem of reductionism in that way. I don't know that it works. It sounds weird, to put it bluntly. I think one of the main problems that I see with the philosophical zombie argument, right, that's supposed to show that, we can't just reduce consciousness to a functioning organism or something like that, the way that we can reduce life to just a functioning cell. That's what it takes to be alive. Right, again, the idea of a philosophical zombie means that, well, that doesn't happen with human beings, because you could have a human being behaving just like any regular human being, and yet lack that internal consciousness, right? This thing that we referred to earlier as having having access to your own mental states. You have privileged access to your own mental states, right? You can't feel my pain. I can tell you about it, but my pain is hidden from you in a certain way, right? Only when I'm in pain, only I can access the actual feeling of the pain. As long as that's the case, then it's hard to reduce consciousness or a particular mental event like being in pain. It's hard to reduce that down to something purely physical. My problem with that argument is that it seems weird to me that a philosophical zombie, if they behave just like us, then they would talk about consciousness, right? You can imagine David Chalmers being a zombie and talking about this special property of being conscious, this special property of experiencing what in the literature is called qualia. Qualia is the qualitative feel of things that we experience as conscious beings, right? So think of the sip of coffee, what it tastes like to you, right? The coffee has a certain qualia to it, a certain qualitative aspect. It is something that it is like for us to taste the coffee, or there's a certain way that it feels to us to be in pain. Right? These are called qualia. Well, so the philosophical zombie would talk about qualia, right? Because they're just like human beings. So this whole qualia idea makes sense, as David Chalmers seems to think it does. Well, then, David Chalmers himself then, theoretically, right, just a thought experiment, logically speaking, could be a zombie, right? If he says zombies are conceivable, then David Chalmers himself could be a zombie and yet still be talking about consciousness and qualia. But I find that completely baffling. I do not understand how they would. Right? It seems as though if qualia and consciousness are real things, then they would cause you to talk about them. But if you are completely lacking those things, then why would you talk about them? And worse than that, even non-zombie David Chalmers, the real David Chalmers, he would not be talking about qualia and consciousness because he's experiencing them. We don't even need that explanation. We've already admitted that all you need is the physical organism to translate inputs to outputs just right. So it seems as though qualia and consciousness have no causal power at all. This is sometimes called epiphenomenalism. So that's basically my critique of David Chalmers. Is David Chalmers, if he's right that philosophical zombies are possibilities that we should take seriously, at least when analyzing concepts like consciousness, then we're going to have to end up admitting that consciousness is not causally efficacious. It doesn't do anything. Right? Because we can explain all of human behavior without it. Right? That's what philosophical zombieism says, is that we could conceive of a fully functioning human being who lacks consciousness. So what this means is that even for regular people, consciousness just doesn't matter. It's not causally efficacious. It doesn't matter that we experience qualia, right, if philosophical zombies are possible. But that then undermines the whole position, because it means that when David Chalmers talks about consciousness and qualia, we can just explain him talking about that on a purely physical level. So it's kind of a tricky thing to think about, but I think it ends up undermining itself, right? Which is not to say there might still be problems with this, right? I do kind of still see the point that consciousness is going to be a little bit different than life. It might be a little bit trickier than that. But it does emerge at a much higher level of complexity. So, maybe that's just inevitable in some way. Okay, so to recap, right, we had substance dualism, still probably the most favorite theory for regular people, especially if you think you're going to keep living after your body dies. It's a nice idea. For philosophers who are not just looking to be comforted, but who actually want to figure out the world, substance dualism for many philosophers anyway, it's too problematic because of all the things that we've already talked about. And scientific people who are interested in the brain also reject substance dualism. And so people have attempted various different ways of making study of the mind scientific to try to fit it within this sort of paradigm, right? This sort of view of reality where we have the different disciplines, the different sciences studying different levels of reality, and each level is ultimately reducible down to the lower level, but these emergent properties arise with increased complexity. And we do see this all over. We see examples of this all over the place. Emergent properties because of higher levels of complexity. I mean, this just happens all the time, right? Just an object like a chair even, right? There's the pile of wood, does not have the functionality of a chair. You put it together the right way. Here we have an emergent property. Here's something that you can sit on comfortably. Look all around you. You'll see examples of this everywhere. So the hope is that consciousness fits into this picture as well. Right now, it's still kind of an open problem, an open question. This is not a philosophical or scientific question that has been completely resolved. I'm just leaving you with what some of the debates are, right? So the debate is, can we fit it into this picture? If not, do we go back to substance dualism, or do we accept this panpsychic view that's consciousness is just part of the natural world, but it's sort of, it's down here as opposed to up here. It's not an emergent property. It's a basic property of the universe. That when you have enough of it, you get something like human consciousness. Is that the correct view, or is there some other view? There's different ways to get at that, but that's the basic issue here. Okay, I wish we were in class talking about this. It's always very difficult to do it this way. Just being honest, it's difficult to try to just talk at my computer. What I end up doing is, instead of looking at the camera, as I should to make it not as weird for you, I end up looking at myself in the corner, because then it feels like I'm talking to someone. Isn't that sad? It's not really sad. Okay. I will see you soon with free will and determinism. Okay. Have a good day. Bye-bye.